Welcome back. This is my personal Sawzall, and the blade holder is broken. I'll put a part number for the replacement part in the description, as well as a list of similar models. I'm going to go ahead and tear this down now. This big screw was being stubborn, so I hit it with a little penetrating oil just to lube it up. Most of the screws on this thing are T20 Torx screws, but they have a little slot for a flathead screwdriver, except for two, which I think those are T15, so we'll get to those in a minute. It may be a little hard to see, but there are 4 screws holding the metal guard on. Because I don't have my Torx screwdrivers at home, I had to come up with this little arrangement. 1/4-inch socket with a T20 bit on it. And it worked fairly well for this one screw. As you can see, there's a slot where the guide can slide off of the moving part. The rubber grip has no additional screws, only the 4 screws holding the guard held it down. The inside of my Sawzall is absolutely filth encrusted. It has seen a lot of use. There are a total of 6 screws holding the gearbox cover on, 4 of these and then 2 near the top. The 2 screws at the top are a different size, and I think they're T15, and they don't have a slot for a flathead screwdriver. This is the guide block for the shaft. And this is a little roller bearing for the gear to transfer motion to the shaft. Here's a comparison of the old shaft and the new shaft. I was a little concerned because the old one has a little spring around it, but the new shaft, you'll see, doesn't have these little hooks on the side, so it's not meant to have the spring, so no big deal. As you can see, the old grease is very dried up. It's probably mixed with a lot of dirt and dust over time. That little gear is the drive gear from the motor, and this is the driven gear. There's 4 screws to take the gearbox off the motor entirely, which I recommend you do. But if you don't want to mess with your motor, that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and tear mine down and inspect it and clean it. And you can skip ahead to this time if you just want to do the gearbox part. There's 5 screws for the handle and 2 screws on either side for the motor vents. There's 2 wires going to the motor with blade connectors that you just pull off. They're not polarized, so don't worry about which one's which. And then there are 2 screws on the back of the motor that hold the field coil in the case. I found out that the field coil and the armature and the little cover on it are all sort of wedged in the case. If you pry very gently on the top of the commutator, you'll get the armature to come out of its place, and then it'll just sort of come apart. The armature and both bearings look very good. I'm just going to give the commutator a go-over with the Scotch-Brite pad to make it shine up. After this, I took all the parts to the shop and cleaned them thoroughly. The gearbox parts with the nasty dry grease I cleaned with solvent in the parts washer. If you want to do this at home, get a couple of cans of engine degreaser, Work over the parts real good with a stiff bristle brush and a lot of elbow grease, and follow up with brake cleaner. For the dusty motor parts, I blew them out with compressed air. Now is a good time to check the free movement of the motor brushes and make sure they're not greasy or worn out. This part's a little tricky, getting the armature into the field coil with the brushes in the way. Getting the bearing past the brushes is pretty easy. You can just hold the brushes aside with your fingers. But once you get to the commutator, it's a little bigger. Apply a slight upward force on the armature and push the brushes aside one at a time with a small screwdriver until it pops into place. Notice the shape on the little cover thing matches the shape on the motor housing, so that's how you know how to align it. Also, make sure to hold the armature and the field coil together firmly, otherwise the armature will just fall straight out of it and you'll have to start again. It doesn't want to go in particularly easy to the housing. Just make sure it stays aligned. There's two plastic bosses on the end of the field coil that match up to where the little bolts go. Because I'm a mechanic, I do a lot of brake jobs, and whenever I do, I get one of these little grease packets that I never use because we use synthetic brake caliper grease. But I also brought along a tub of regular axle grease just as a backup in case I didn't have enough packets. I just want to use the packets up, basically. The little cylindrical part on the end, between the gear on the end of the shaft and the ball bearing, is a moving part, and it doesn't have a bearing, so it needs to be greased liberally. This is why I recommended taking the gearbox off of the motor so that you could grease this. The roller bearing in the center of the gear needs to be greased liberally. Now, because I washed all my parts, the bearing has no grease in it at all, and it needs to be repacked. So I put my fingers on either side and force the grease into it as much as I can. Make note of the wear pattern on the plate. The side with the round wear pattern is facing the gear. This little plate above the felt can only sit one way. There's a slot in the end of the gearbox that lets you know which way it goes. This is another roller bearing. One end is rounded and the other is flat. The flat side should be down, sitting on top of the gear. Grease this little block as well. One side of this rubber gasket has an indent that indicates which side faces down, so you can pretty much only put it one way. See, this time I actually brought my screwdriver so I can drive those screws in easily. You want it super tight because this thing vibrates and it will shake loose if it's not tight. As I previously mentioned, this motor is not polarized, so you can put either wire on either side. Hey, if you liked this video, don't forget to like this video. Consider subscribing, and thanks for watching.